Saint-Luc Sanatorium had long been the stuff of legends and scary stories for the locals. This immense building, perched high in the Alps, had been abandoned for over 50 years. Its past was shrouded in rumors, experiments on patients, and mysterious disappearances. It was this very sanatorium that had attracted a group of young researchers, determined to make a documentary film about the history of the place. The protagonists were 4 friends: Louis, Antoine, Claire, and Marie. Louis was the project's operator, responsible for shooting and editing. His friends often joked that he was colorblind, as he couldn't tell red from green. For Louis, this had long been a part of his daily life, and he had learned to ignore such friendly teasing. The trip to the sanatorium had taken several hours. They'd hired a car to get them to this mountainous region, and as they approached, the road became increasingly narrow and winding. The Alps rose before them, shrouded in fog, and the landscape grew darker and darker. Claire, sitting next to Louis in the back, watched the mountains draw closer and sighed. "This sanatorium looks like something out of a horror movie," she said, with a hint of concern in her voice. "That's exactly why we're here," replied Antoine, who was behind the wheel. "Imagine what a great movie we're going to make. Legends, mystery, an abandoned building. Everything you need for a good story." Marie, sitting up front, nodded in agreement with Antoine. She was the project's director and the main initiator of this trip. Her passion for abandoned places and mystical stories knew no bounds, and the Saint-Luc Sanatorium had become her new obsession. "As long as we don't come across anything really dangerous," she joked. And everyone in the car burst out laughing. By the time they reached the village at the foot of the mountain, the sun was already setting. The locals watched them suspiciously as they entered a small cafe to eat before heading up to the sanatorium. An old man, sitting by the window, leaned towards them and said in a low voice, "Don't go, nobody ever comes back." The friends looked at each other, unsure how to react to this warning. Antoine smiled and replied, "Don't worry, we'll be careful." The old man didn't reply, just shook his head and plunged back into his coffee. Despite the worried looks on the villagers' faces, the team set off. The sanatorium was at the top of a hill, and the only road to it snaked through the trees like a snake's tail. Finally, after several hours on the road, they arrived at their destination. The Saint-Luc Sanatorium stood before them like a gigantic ghost from the past. The building was impressive, even in its dilapidated state. Some of the windows were broken. The roof had partially collapsed, but the structure still retained a certain eerie grandeur. "This place seems frozen in time," Louis murmured, observing the building. They unloaded their equipment and entered. The interior was just as impressive. Corridors descending into darkness, rusty operating tables, scattered documents, and chairs placed in threatening positions, as if awaiting their owner's return. "We'll start shooting tomorrow," says Marie, surveying the rooms. "Tonight, we rest and prepare." Everyone nodded in agreement. Louis set up cameras to record what might happen during the night in case of any strange phenomena. He, like his friends, was curious to know if the stories of mysterious lights and supernatural events were true. Before falling asleep, Louis took one last look around the room. An old mirror lay in the corner, covered in dust, but the moonlight, shining through the windows, was reflected in it. He thought he saw the light behaving strangely, but attributed this to the fatigue of the long journey. As he drifted off to sleep, Louis thought back to the old man's words in the village. "Nobody ever comes back." These words echoed in his head as he fell into a restless sleep. The morning in the abandoned sanatorium came slowly. Waking up, Louis felt a strange heaviness in the air. The light shining through the broken windows seemed dimmer than it should have been, as if the building itself was absorbing energy from the outside. His friends were already on their feet. Marie, energetic as ever, was getting ready for her first day of filming. "Louis, come on up! We've got to get it all in before dark!" she shouted as she passed his room. Louis got up, pulled on his jacket, and went out into the hallway. Antoine was already setting up the cameras. Claire was looking at the old maps of the sanatorium they had found among the scattered papers. The atmosphere in the building seemed strange, almost eerie, but neither of them wanted to admit it. "This place is too big," Antoine said, looking around. "It'll be hard to get around in one day." "We'll split into pairs," Marie suggested. "Louis, you go with Antoine, and I'll go with Claire. It'll be quicker that way." They agreed, and soon everyone was ready to get to work. Louis and Antoine went to the basement, where they thought they could find the most interesting documents and traces of experiments. They descended the creaky stairs, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. The basement was dark, damp, and cold, its walls covered in mold. In one of the rooms, Louis came across old blueprints hidden in a metal box. These documents turned out to be surprisingly well preserved despite the dampness. One of the blueprints showed a strange apparatus, some kind of light generator connected to wires and electrical devices. The caption read, "Experiment on mental stimulation through light impulses." "What can this be?" Louis asked, holding out the document to Antoine. Antoine looked at the drawing and shrugged. "It looks like some kind of light therapy. But from what we know about this place, I wouldn't trust those experiments." Louis hummed, agreeing. He continued rummaging through the drawer and found a few more documents. Among them were descriptions of patients who had been subjected to light therapy. Some of the records said that the patients began to see dancing lights and hear voices. This seemed a strange coincidence with local legends. They continued exploring the basement and came across another find, an old mirror that stood in the corner of one of the rooms. Its surface was covered in dust, but when Louis wiped it clean, he noticed something strange. His reflection looked slightly distorted, as if something was wrong. He looked at Antoine, but he didn't pay any attention to it. "It's just an old mirror," Antoine said, noticing Louis staring at his reflection thoughtfully. "Dust, dirt. Don't pay any attention to it." But Louis couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong here. His reflection seemed too still, as if it had frozen in one pose when he had already turned away. "Okay, let's move on," Louis said as he looked away from the mirror. He felt something unpleasant clench in his chest. They continued their search, and soon came across a door leading to an even deeper part of the basement. The door was painted with red paint, but Louis, due to his color blindness, couldn't recognize it. Antoine was teasing him again. "Louis, be careful." "You know, red doors are always the most dangerous," he laughed. Louis smiled back, but his anxiety increased. They entered the room behind the door and found themselves in an old laboratory. Here, it looked as if the scientists had left the place in a hurry, leaving behind equipment and documents. There were red symbols hanging on the walls that Louis hadn't seen, but Antoine had told him that they looked like strange, almost mystical signs. "I don't like this place," Antoine muttered as he looked around. "I'd better take pictures and get out of here." Louis couldn't agree more. His sense of unease was growing with every minute he was in the sanatorium. Night fell quickly in the abandoned sanatorium. It was getting dark outside the windows, and the only source of light was a few flashlights and the moonlight shining through the broken windows. The team gathered in one of the center halls, discussing plans for the next day. Antoine, as always, was enthusiastic and offered some bold ideas for filming, while Claire seemed somewhat distracted. "It's all very interesting, but I think there's something wrong here," she said, looking at the dark corridors leading deep into the sanatorium. "You're overly suspicious," Antoine smiled. "It's just an old building. Everything looks gloomy. Tomorrow, in the light of day, everything will seem less intimidating." Marie agreed, but Louis noticed that Claire kept looking around. Her eyes were tired, and her voice sounded quiet, as if something was bothering her. "Maybe you should rest," Louis suggested. "We're all tired after a long day. Tomorrow would be easier." Claire nodded, but instead of joining the others, she rose quietly and walked out of the hall, heading towards the stairs leading to the second floor. Her movements were slow, as if she was under some sort of hypnosis. Louis wanted to offer to go with her, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was fatigue, or the same strange feeling that had prevailed in this place since the beginning. Time passed, and the team slowly began to settle down to sleep. When an hour had passed, Marie noticed that Claire still hadn't returned. "She's long gone," Marie said, looking around the empty room. "Do you think she's all right?" Antoine grinned. "Probably just went for a walk. Maybe looking for some interesting place to shoot for tomorrow." But Louis wasn't so sure. Anxiety was growing in him, so he decided to go check on Claire. He went up to the second floor, lighting the way with a flashlight. The corridors seemed to grow longer and darker as he progressed. The walls were covered in cracks, and the floor made creaking noises under his feet. Louis could feel the silence pressing in on him, and it was more than just a feeling of loneliness. After walking past a few rooms, Louis suddenly noticed something on the floor. It was Claire's cell phone. It was lying in the middle of the hallway. The screen was out. Louis picked it up and tried to turn it on, but the battery was dead. A feeling of dread began to build up inside him. He lit up the corridor further and noticed strange markings on the walls. They were red, but Louis couldn't see the color. To him, they were just dark marks. But he knew it had to be something sinister. Feeling a presence behind him, Louis turned around sharply, but there was no one behind him. Just emptiness and silence. He quickly went downstairs to tell the others. "I found her phone, but she's nowhere to be found," he said as he walked into the center hall. Marie and Antoine looked at each other and then stood up. "Let's go look for her," Antoine said, his confidence shaken a little. "We can't leave her behind." three friends began to scour the building, illuminating every corner of the corridors with their flashlights. Louis continued to feel a strange pressure, as if the walls were closing in around him. It seemed as if the very structure of the building was changing, becoming more and more impenetrable. At one point, they came across the red symbols on the walls again. "Antoine, what are these?" Louis asked, illuminating the sign with his flashlight. Antoine took one look and turned pale. "It looks like ancient runes or symbols." "I don't know for sure, but something tells me it's not just graffiti." Louis felt a chill in his chest. He knew something strange was going on with this place, and Claire's disappearance was just the beginning. "We have to be careful," Marie whispered, looking at the symbols. Whatever it wasn't random. Their search continued late into the night, but they never found Claire. It was as if she had vanished, disappearing into the darkness of the sanitarium. Louis couldn't get rid of the thought that the light they had seen the night before was somehow connected to her disappearance. Now, every corner of the building, every sound, seemed ominous. After a fruitless search for Claire, the night passed in anxiety and tension. Louis couldn't sleep. Every sound in the old building made him shiver. The creaks of the floorboards, the sound of the wind outside the window, and even his own breathing seemed ominous. It seemed as if the building itself was trying to tell him something, but it was only an empty echo of fear. When dawn broke, Marie and Antoine, despite their fatigue, decided to continue their search for Claire. Not being able to understand what had happened to her depressed all three of them. Louis felt that with each passing hour, something important was slipping away. The sanatorium was beginning to show its real face, and that face was terrifying. "We have to find her," Antoine said, his voice sounding more nervous than he wanted it to. She couldn't just disappear. There had to be a logical answer. Louis and Marie nodded, agreeing. But there was a growing feeling inside Louis that this was all beyond logic. Something dark, intangible, and almost indistinguishable was taking possession of this place. They split up again to comb through the rest of the building. Louis headed toward the old wings of the sanitarium, which they had not yet entered. There, in the semi-dark corridors, his flashlight illuminated the cracked walls, as if the building itself had been consumed by time. Suddenly, the flashlight's light began to flicker, and that's when he noticed something on the edge of visibility. A faint, almost elusive light that moved ahead. At first, Louis thought it was a play of light and shadow. But when that light reappeared, he realized that something was moving in the corridor in front of him. The light was not static. It was dancing, moving fluidly, beckoning behind him. Louis felt his heart sink. This light didn't look like an ordinary glow. It was as if it was alive, as if it was calling to him, beckoning him to follow. For a moment, Louis wondered if this was the same mysterious, dancing light anomaly the locals had told him about. "It can't be real," Louis whispered under his breath, trying to keep his cool. But his feet, as if against his will, began to follow the light. He was walking down a long corridor, the walls of which were becoming more and more strange, as if vibrating with the presence of this light. Every moment, this light was getting closer. But as soon as Louis tried to catch up with it, it moved farther away. It was like a strange game where the light was always one step ahead. He felt like he was losing control of himself. Logic was receding, leaving room for fear and misunderstanding. When he reached the end of the corridor, an old, dilapidated door appeared in front of him. Behind it, the light disappeared completely. Louis stood in front of the door, feeling his hands shaking. He didn't know what to do next. Open the door or go back. At that moment, a voice came out of the darkness. Louis. It was a quiet, barely audible whisper. The voice seemed familiar, but distorted, as if from another world. Louis turned around sharply, shining his flashlight down the hallway. But there was no one there. He heard the whisper again, but now the voice was closer. Louis, come here. It was Claire's voice. But something in that voice was wrong, something unnatural, as if someone was trying to imitate her. Louis's heart beat faster. He stood in front of the door, hesitant to open it. But if it was Claire, he couldn't just leave. He took a deep breath and slowly pushed the door open. The room beyond the door was huge and completely dark, except for the same strange light that hung in the air in the center of the room. It was soft, but its light seemed ominous, as if someone's shadow lurked within it. Louis slowly walked into the room, holding the flashlight at the ready. He looked around carefully, trying to figure out what this place was. His gaze slid over old medical devices that were scattered on the floor, as if someone had left the place in a hurry. Suddenly, the light started moving again. This time, it began to swirl, making smooth movements around Louis, and he felt his consciousness fogging up. Everything around him seemed unreal, like a nightmare where the lines between reality and fantasy disappear. Louis! Claire's voice came again, but now it came from the light itself. Louis froze. A vision appeared before him. Claire was standing in the center of the light, holding out her hand to him. She looked the same as before, but her eyes were empty, lifeless. "Help me, Louis," she whispered. But something inside Louis screamed that this was a trap. He took a step back, feeling his legs give a shake. The light began to come closer, surrounding him on all sides. Now he realized it wasn't just a light. It was an entity, alive and sinister, hunting souls. He rushed for the exit, feeling the light literally reaching for him. Running out of the room, Louis slammed the door shut and leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. His mind was racked with terror. He didn't know what it was, but he knew one thing. It wasn't Claire. It couldn't be her. Louis was breathing heavily, leaning against the wall. His heart was beating like crazy, and his thoughts were racing, making it hard to focus. That light he'd seen, that essence he'd almost touched, it wasn't an illusion. He knew that for sure now. Claire was gone, and the light seemed to be playing with him, manipulating his mind and the perceived world. He looked at the closed door, behind which the light consumed the space. Two feelings fought inside him: the desire to escape and fear for his friends. What if Claire was still alive? What if she really needed help? But something inside Louis screamed that it was all a lie. He no longer knew what was real and what was just a figment of his imagination. Suddenly, he heard footsteps, and his heart beat even faster. He grabbed his flashlight and pointed it at the source of the sound. It was Antoine, who appeared from around the corner, his face anxious. "Louis, what's wrong? You disappeared somewhere." Antoine looked like he was on the verge of a nervous breakdown as well. "Claire, I saw her, or her shadow," Louis muttered. It's not her. It's something else." Antoine frowned, trying to comprehend Louis's words. "What are you talking about? What do you mean it's not her?" "I don't know." Louis shook his head, trying to deal with his growing panic. "I saw a light, and that light beckoned to me. I saw her, but it wasn't a person. It was something else." Antoine was silent for a moment, then looked at the door behind which Louis had seen the light. "We have to get out of here. This sanitarium, there's something wrong with it. We have to find Marie and get out." Louis agreed. They decided to find Marie and leave the sanatorium without wasting any more time. But as they walked back down the corridors, the building seemed to begin to change. The walls seemed to move. The corridors became longer, and the turns took them to the same places they had already been. "This is crazy," Antoine whispered, looking around. "We're going in circles." Louis felt his mind becoming more and more confused. He began to lose his sense of time and space, not realizing where they were. It all resembled a nightmare from which one cannot wake up. The light he saw seemed to become a part of this place, soaking into its walls and distorting everything around him. They walked down a few more corridors, and suddenly they heard Marie's voice. She was screaming, but her voice sounded unnatural, as if it came from far away, as if someone had used her voice for a trap. "Marie!" Louis shouted, but his voice echoed through the empty hallways without a response. "Are you sure it was her?" Antoine asked, looking around nervously. "I don't know," Louis answered, feeling his fear turn to panic. "But we have to check." They headed toward the sound, but with each step, the sense of reality slipped away more and more. The space around them began to vibrate, as if the walls were transparent and the corridors endless. Time seemed to stretch, as if the clock had slowed down, and their own footsteps sounded muffled and deafening. At some point, they reached a large hall. It was an ancient operating room, all covered in dust and cobwebs. There were old medical devices lying in the middle of the room, but nothing moved. The lights began to flicker again, however, becoming more and more intense. "We have to get out of here," Antoine said again, trying to stay calm, though his voice was shaking. But Louis could no longer move. His mind was overwhelmed by the images of light that flashed before his eyes. He felt like he was losing touch with reality, as if the light was penetrating his mind, rewriting his memory and thoughts. And then Claire's voice came again. "Louis, help me, please." But Louis knew it wasn't her. It was the same light, the same essence that was trapping him. "It's not her," he whispered to himself, clenching his fists. It wasn't Claire, but the light was persistent. It was coming closer, enveloping his consciousness, robbing him of his ability to think clearly. Whatever was left of his reality was shattered. Louis looked at Antoine, who was beginning to lose control. His eyes widened with terror. "We have to go," Antoine shouted. But Louis didn't hear him. The light had completely taken over his mind. He tried to resist, every effort seemed futile. The light was too strong, too intense, as if the very essence of this place was consuming him. Antoine. Louis struggled to speak, but the words disappeared in the swirl of light. Antoine rushed to the exit, but the door closed on its own, leaving him trapped with Louis and the light that continued to swirl around, gradually engulfing them both. Louis felt his body grow heavy and his consciousness become blurry. At the last moment before the light completely engulfed him, he heard one last whisper. "You are now one of us." Louis woke up on the cold floor, his body heavy and his head buzzing as if someone was pounding on his skull from inside. The light, that strange, living light that had surrounded him, was gone, leaving only the dim illumination from his flashlight, which was lying nearby. There was a sepulchral silence in the room. The entire sanatorium seemed to stand still for a moment, as if the building itself were watching his breathing. He struggled to his feet, feeling the world around him shaking. His thoughts were confused, but one thing was clear. He had to find a way to stop what was happening in this place. Claire, Antoine, they were all gone, and they were probably dead. But if Louis still had any hope left, he had to act. His gaze fell on the map they had studied earlier. In the depths of the building was something that resembled an engine room. Louis remembered the old blueprints of the generator they had found in the basement and realized that this might be the cause of all these nightmares. A generator that somehow powered the light and absorbed the reality around it. He took the flashlight, clutching it like a weapon, and slowly made his way towards the basement. The corridors he walked seemed endless, and the walls seemed alive. They seemed to breathe, moving in time with his steps. Louis tried to ignore it, concentrating on one thing: getting to the generator. Down an old staircase that creaked with every step, Louis found himself in a semi-dark basement. It was cold and damp, and the smell of mold and decay filled the air. His footsteps echoed off the walls. All around him were old appliances, most of which had long been abandoned. In the depths of the basement, however, he saw something that caught his eye. A huge metal device surrounded by cables and old monitors. It was a generator. It looked like a strange hybrid of old and new. Mechanisms reminiscent of something from the last century were connected to modern machinery that seemed out of place in this forgotten place. Cables wrapped around it seemed to stretch to the walls, like living veins feeding the place with energy. Louis slowly approached the generator. There were two levers on its front panel, one red and one green. Seeing them, he felt a rush of fear. These colors. His friends had always teased him about his colorblindness, and now it was a real problem. He couldn't distinguish between these colors. To him, both levers looked the same. "Damn," he whispered, feeling his hands start to shake. He knew that one of those levers could have shut down the generator, and the other could have possibly activated it even more, amplifying the effects of the light. But which one? He remembered Antoine laughing at him once, explaining that red was danger and green was salvation. But now, when faced with this choice, his mind refused to work. Fear paralyzed him. Louis turned around, trying to find some clue, but there was nothing around him but darkness and silence. It was as if the sanitarium was waiting for his decision, and that decision was on the edge between life and death. He had to choose. Gathering his wits, Louis slowly reached out to one of the levers. His breathing became ragged. His heart was beating so hard, it felt like it was going to jump out of his chest. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to calm himself, and then pulled the lever with determination. At the same instant, the room was illuminated by a bright light. Louis jerked back sharply, his eyes unable to adjust to the brightness. The generator started up with a new, deafening hum. Louis realized he had made a mistake. Instead of stopping it, he activated it to full power. Light began to fill the room. It seemed alive, as if the air itself was glowing and growing denser. Louis felt his body begin to lose weight, as if he was being pulled upwards into the very thick of the light. It was like he was losing control of his body, and his consciousness was sinking into a deep whirlpool. He tried to resist, but it was all useless. The light had completely taken over his mind. The last thing he heard before the darkness consumed him was a whisper. "You chose wrong." Louis felt the light engulfing him, as if thousands of invisible hands were pulling him into the void. The space around him became unreal, and time itself seemed to disappear. He couldn't tell how much time had passed since he had activated the generator. His mind was in chaos. Images, sounds, memories blended together, creating a strange, disjointed mosaic where it was hard to distinguish reality from illusion. The light was everywhere. It permeated everything around him, filling every corner, every shadow. Louis felt it not only with his eyes, but with his whole skin. This light was alive. It didn't just illuminate space. It breathed, moved, vibrated, and its pulsation penetrated into Louis's heart. "You chose wrong," the light whispered, its voice everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Louis tried to concentrate to figure out what was happening, but every time he found a foothold in his memory or thoughts, the light took over again. His mind was becoming fragmented. He could no longer remember what had happened before they arrived at the sanitarium. The faces of his friends began to fade from his memories. Antoine, Claire, Marie. They seemed distant shadows, almost mirages that melted away in this unnatural light. Suddenly, one of the mirrors he had seen before in this building appeared before Louis's eyes. The reflection in it was strange. It was him, but with some terrible, distorted grimace, as if his face belonged to someone else. He took a step back, but the mirror followed him, the distorted images continuing to haunt him. Louis began to realize that he had become part of this light. He was no longer the man who had come to this sanitarium. The light had taken control of him, filled his mind with its shadows. Everything he knew, everything he loved, was now just a ghost in a distant memory. He tried to fight the feeling, clinging to the remnants of common sense. But the light was too strong, its influence too deep. Saint-Luc's Sanatorium was now his home, and the light was his new master. He no longer belonged to himself. The sense of time had completely disappeared. Louis no longer knew how many minutes, hours, or days had passed. At some point, he realized that he could no longer feel his body. He was just an observer floating in this endless glow. But then the light began to change. It began to go out, as if someone was reducing its intensity. Louis saw the walls of the sanitarium begin to return to their former shape. But it didn't bring relief. On the contrary, he realized that the light was preparing for another round. His last thoughts were that this cycle would never end. He had made a choice, and that choice trapped him forever. The light would continue to exist, manipulating time, reality, and those who dared to come here after him. Louis was now part of this cycle. He had become shadows, part of the light that would call for new victims. Those who will be tempted to enter the old Saint-Luc Sanatorium. Those who will not realize that this light is more than an illusion. We're always waiting. The light whispered as the world around Louis finally disappeared.